The Great Central Railway is the UK's only double-track mainline heritage railway. It's the only heritage line where full-size steam engines can be seen passing each other at speed, just as it was when steam ruled the rails. Join the Hornby Magazine team as they embark on building a brand new 00 gauge layout. Come with us as we visit the railway and explore new techniques in this all-new 4-part series. Building the Great Central Railway.
So hello and welcome once again to the Great Central Railway build series. Today you join us for the fourth and final part, which is building Swidland sidings. So Mike, as everyone at home can see, it's as good as done.
It is, as good as done, maybe complete is the word here. I wouldn't say it's actually finished. I think there's probably more things we could do to this side of the layout. A bit more track work detail, a bit more weathering maybe, fewer things of details around the railway, but it's certainly well on the way. I could probably write you a list right now of 20 jobs I'd like to do, but...
And the rest.
Yeah, and the rest.
So if I take us back a bit, before we decided to do Swidland sidings, it was very much going to be the station side, and then storage yard. And then I suppose it became a really good idea to do Swidland sidings because you can have a scenic storage yard.
Yeah, so we talked about it a little bit in one of the previous videos actually. Sort of typically with a model railway, when we build one for the magazine, we tend to build it for exhibitions where we want to have lots of trains to run through a scene. So we traditionally build a scene, which is Quor Magna, and then all of the other side would be a set of storage sidings where it's just a plain board with lots of track on it, loads of trains stored in it. Everyone loves seeing the storage yard anyway. But thought, well, why not make something of that area and make it more of a feature and create a fully 4-sided layout, which also recreates more of the Great Central Railway route as well. So if you imagine like riding down the Great Central Railway and you arrived at Quorn Station, our version being Quor Magna, and then you continue from Quorn and you head down the line, a very truncated bit of line, but then you get to a place called Rabbit Bridge on the Great Central Railway, which just off that lovely curve at Kinchley Lane. That's kind of what that corner over there is with the bridge. Then you go over Swidland Reservoir, which will be what the blank board will become in a few months' time. And then after Swidland Reservoir, obviously, then you sweep round the curve and you come through Swidland sidings, which is one of my favourite railway locations actually on the Reserve Railway network, because all of a sudden you've got a big mainline freight yard with passing loops. You've got mainline route through the middle, you've got big signal box, you've got all the trains stored to the sides, and you've also got this lovely sweeping curve as it comes through as well.
So for those at home, going to the real Great Central Railway, what would the Great Central use Swidland sidings for?
Well, it was originally actually, I think, part of the junction to Mount Sorrel Quarry. And actually, the Great Central Railway of the preservation era has restored part of that branch line as well. We have actually got the branch connection on the railway as well. It doesn't go anywhere at this point, but the suggestion is there that it would be there one day, which is a little bit like the Reserve Railway did. So they had the connection, but they hadn't reconnected it back to the quarry. So it was then quarry trains would come up to the sidings, be shunted around or prepared, or be used as exchange sidings, and then the trains would make their way onto their destinations.
And of course, with any modern railway, it's all about compromise. So we can't have got all of the Swidland sidings on a 16-foot length.
No, there's
got to be something missing.
Yeah, there's things missing, and there's also a couple of additions as well. So one of the primary things I think most people recognise are missing actually is the road bridge that ducts under the railways that enters the sidings. Time constraints and space meant we just weren't really able to introduce that as well onto this railway. But it's one of those features that I think we probably get away with. Maybe not. People might tell me differently. And then the other thing really is actually that, particularly at this end of Swidland side, the south end, the railway is actually curving away the opposite direction to what our curve is, and a much more gentle radius as well. Because it sweeps around the corner to the right there instead of turning to the left, and then just goes over a crest of the hill and then straight line down into Roadley Station there. So that is going the opposite way. One of the things I do think we should add though, actually, is we should have a pylon here and a pylon there. because it's quite a distinctive pylon route across the railway there as well, isn't it? So,
I'd say it makes a nice backdrop too for the sidings, the big pylons.
it does, yeah. So I've got a really nice picture of Black Fire coming through there, actually. So one of the other additions as well that we've made is actually to add these two sidings here. They aren't at Swidland sidings today, but they added a little bit of useful locomotive / stock storage space for us for a model railway. And again, that was one of those kind of things where I went, well, they're not there, but actually for us, it's got some benefit to have them there as well.
We've mentioned it all through this build series. Although we're trying to replicate a real place, it does need to be a model railway with play value.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important. We've got to be able to enjoy running it and operating it, and that is part of that value for us as well. And I think the other thing that's actually really quite obviously missing, and I'm actually feeling a little bit guilty about saying this is complete now, really, is actually this area here is way too bland. There's just not enough going off on there. So I need to be getting some trees or making some trees and adding some much more detailed foliage around there. So, keep an eye out. We'll certainly be adding that to this layout and making it come to life more there as well.
So as we said, it'll be finished in time for the Whalley exhibition late in 2022.
That's right, yeah. So by that time, we'll have all this area fully finished. We'll have all the reservoir bridge finished. Touch wood, yeah. Where is it? Yeah. Because that's quite a big task. We've got the model builders building the bridges for us at the moment. But it's going to be a big task for him to build those and then ship all the parts to us so we can build that corner. And then we've got the pleasure of creating all the reservoir as well with the resin casting water. So watch this space. So, obviously right now we can say there's going to be a part 5, but it's just not going to be straight away.
And talking of our sacrificial lamb who's building the bridge for us, Paul Chapman built the signal boxes.
He did. He built both signal boxes. Absolutely brilliant. Projects that we couldn't possibly have fitted in on our timescale with everything else we had to do with the layout. So we got Paul to scratch build those 2 models for us. And there is a full step-by-step guide for that, both in the Hornby Magazine yearbook from 2022. And you can also now read that feature if you're a subscriber online at keymodelworld.com as well.
Yeah. And I have to say, this is quite a bare side to the layout, even if it is a mass storage yard. But those signal boxes really do bring it back to the Great Central.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm looking at this, and bare is the word. Actually, I think I feel the need to do more to this right now. And again, it's quite nice with these sidings. They're quite decent length sidings as well, so you can have some nice long trains in here as well, and then enjoy running them.
So it is looking complete. But how did we get to this stage? Because obviously we built this to a deadline.
Yes.
And seemingly flew through the process. And Swidland Sidings became almost a victim of our deadline because we had to really rush to get it done. So it wasn't as an intense a filming process because I had to wade in with the modelling, which is unheard of,
yes.
to get it done. So where did you start?
So we started with this with the track work. And the track was the most important part of this to get right. That sweeping curve through the sidings was even before we'd put the scenery on, I loved that. It looked brilliant with the shape of the railway. And I've always liked that kind of thing with you could easily just made all these straight tracks. Made life technically simple on paper. But I think it would have looked half the layout it is by being straight. So that was the place we started, getting the track laid, getting all the formation together, assembling all the points to the track, and again getting all the point motors in underneath as well. Because all the points on here are controlled by DCC Concepts Cobalt point motors. And then from there, well, the next big task was to weather all the track. Everything we've done, and I've mentioned this before in the series, is all about building things up in layers. So if I get a base layer of dark brown over everything, then we've got something to build from. It tones down all the plastic of the sleepers originally, it tones down all the sides of the rails, and we can then come and add extra layers of paint on top of that to start deepening that weathering effect on the rail sides on the sleepers as well.
And what better time to have a really bright idea to try a new method than the last day of our build schedule for me to then decide to want to paint each sleeper individually?
Yes. I told you it was a bad idea at the time versus the time we had available. And to be fair, I think it does add something, but it doesn't add much for the amount of time that went into it. I think
if you're at home,
I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think if you're at home and you really want to go the extra mile to really make something of those kind of things, it's definitely worth it. I think as in our build world, it probably wasn't worth it. So, I think we could have got similar effects a much quicker way. But it does add something to it, I've got to say. And I did heed, and I didn't weather the track quite as heavily on this side, so you can see some of that detail come through as well. Track weathering is good. But yes, it's all about those layers. So first layer, dark brown aerosol. Second layer in this case was the dry brushing with multiple colours as well, wasn't it, you went through?
Oh yes, three colours,
yeah. It's,
simple, however...
Simple, time consuming, yeah, exactly. So coming back at the end of the day going, I ain't got any bars down yet. Drying time's running out. Nights before, drying time, yeah. And then from there it's back to the ballasting again once we've got all that done. So the ballasting for the same method we used on Quorn Magnum. So it's all Woodland Scenics ballast, so it's that combination of the medium and the fine grade ballasts, which are mixed together in a tub. Gives you a nice, I feel, quite a nice blend between the two different grades of ballast. And by using the grey blend colour as well, you've got that slight different colour fleck in them as well. That was all laid by hand, then set in place with PVA glue diluted with water as well. So having done this layer, I've actually since then I've adjusted my method for ballasting now as well. And I actually tend to use SBR adhesive, which is a similar type of adhesive to PVA, but it's an all-weather type adhesive. And I found it flows much easier into the track, into the ballast to set it into place, and it dries quicker, and it's still clear as well when it's finished as well. So I found that a little bit easier to do. A lot less mixing involved as well. So.
And of course, with the sidings, you had to have signals.
Yes, but for the sharp-eyed, you'd think we've got the wrong signals. But what we decided to do is, obviously in Great Central days, this would have been upper quadrant signals, being on the Great Central Railway. But in preservation, the Great Central Railway preservation, they've used Great Western lower quadrant signals because the signal box is from Aylesbury. And they wanted to replicate the connection between the Great Central Railway and the Great Western network down at Aylesbury. So it's all lower quadrant signals here in preservation, and we decided to mirror that in the model and introduce a full set of Dapple's working lower quadrant Great Western semaphores, which for me, I think they look great.
It's nice that you can control them direct from the controller. It's very satisfying, and again, play value.
Yeah, exactly. Every single train movement is signalled. And they all work, it's brilliant. So there's two different types of signals. So the single post signals, they are the earlier ones that Dapple did, which have got a small motor which winds the signal arm up and down. They have a different type of decoder that runs those. So that's an SC3 decoder, which is now available through GaugeMaster. It's one of the train tech decoders. Basically, you follow the wiring instructions, you plug the right cables into the right holes, and the signal works. You can address them and program to different numbers as well, so you've got that full control with them. The latest bracket signals, they're all controlled by servos. They have a different base on them, so they've got a bigger base on them with all the servos in them. And they have a different type of train tech decoder, which is bespoke to those signals as well, which is called SC4. And that then controls those and allows them to be raised and lowered. And the most satisfying thing about those is the bounce. So when you bring the signal back up, it bobs. It hits the box.
And of course, moving on from the signals, it wouldn't be a complete scene without I'm going to trademark it, the Mike Wild grass scene that you seem
wild
to have
grass.
perfected over the last few layouts.
Yeah, still there's more perfection for that, I think, as well. It's, I love doing the static grass work and adding the depth and the texture to it. It's, again, same thing as the weathering in the track. It's all about the layers. One layer of static grass is never enough. It always needs 2 or 3, and then I'll come back sometimes and add another 2 or 3 on top of that as well. And it's just a first layer of Woodland Scenics fine green turf, which covers everything. Then a layer of static grass on top of that, and then I can put another layer on top of that, and then scrunch it together and add another layer on top of that in places. Then I start adding extra layers on top of that, and you keep spraying it over with. I use very readily available matte or satin spray paint, just spray paint varnish, so it's clear. And you keep spraying areas of it, applying static grass or other textures on top, and you start to really build up the depth of the grass as well. Then,
I was going to say, because it doesn't always come out on camera, but there are so many different colours and variants and textures, even on just what you could say is the base layer.
yes,
It really does look good in person.
yeah.
So, as I say, it's definitely worth coming to see this layout at a show.
That's right. And one of the things actually I'd really like to do for Swidland is just add a little low height back scene on it, because one of the things it would really benefit from, and actually you'll see it in some of the pictures of the book in the yearbook for this as well, is actually we added a back scene on temporarily whilst doing the photographs, and having a low rising row of bushes along the back here actually really finishes it off. Kind of gives that sense that the world does continue, rather than sometimes with it being flat like this, it could just look a bit kind of, well, we gave up. It's a bit flat. But there's ways we can enhance that. And again, when it comes to part 5, which is now very much clearly coming in the future. Spoiler. Yeah. So part 5, we'll be doing the bridge, and we'll be doing some more work on the scenery in there as well. We'll show you how we do all that to make it come to life.
I don't think I've got it in me to do part 5.
Oh, I have. It's, today anyway.
Because that becomes part 6 very quickly. And of course, a sidings wouldn't be a sidings without its rolling stock. We talk about the scenery, the track, the signals all day long, but really it's about the rolling stock.
Definitely.
Now, I pestered you a while ago, when it was in its previous home, to go through some of the rolling stock we might see on the GCR that we can get in model form. So let's take a look at that now.
So we'll start with the steam motive power that we've got on the layout today. And I think before I actually look at the loco specifically, just a little bit of an overview of what happened on the Great Central Railway from over the years. So it started out as its own railway company when the railway was built in the late 1890s. And it had the chief engineer of J.G. Robinson. And he was responsible for building quite a few of the important locomotives that ran on the line in its early years. So that included locomotives like the D11 440s. He also built some 460s, and probably one of the best known GCR locos in terms of recent history actually probably be the 04280, because one of them is preserved, part of the National Collection, and it's based at the Great Central Railway at Loughborough as well, and that's 63601. He was also responsible for some smaller locos as well, like the J11 pom-poms, and they're quite characterful little locomotives, and we've got one of those in the layout today, which we'll have a look at in a moment. At the 1923 grouping, the Great Central Railway became part of the London North Eastern Railway. At that time, Robinson's GCR locos continued in service on the Great Central Railway network, but then started to be joined by locomotives from the LNER collection as well. So then you start to see things like LNER A3s coming through on the fast express trains, and the V2 started to turn up as well. And plus, at the very end of the LNER period as well, you start to see 1 or 2 of the B1s coming in as well. Moving on to the early BR period, so from 1948, the Great Central Railway became part of British Railways Eastern region to start with. And at that time, basically the motive power stayed pretty much the same as it had in LNER days. But as time moved on and you got into the early 1950s, those ex-LNER locomotives started to be joined by some of the early BR standards as well. Things like BR Standard 5s and 9F started to turn up on the line as well. Moving on a few more years later, and you come to the end of the 1950s, and actually then the Great Central Railway had a change of management. So it was changed from being managed by the Eastern region to being managed by the London Midland region instead. And that caused quite a big change in how the railway was presented, because no longer was it Eastern region locomotives that were the prime motive power. It now started to become ex-LMS locomotives instead. So, for example, Stanier 8S started to be seen on freight trains on a regular basis, and they were joined by things like Stanier Black 5s and also rebuilt Royal Scots as well, which were used for hauling the parcels and passenger trains. The change of management to the Midland region was also part of the start of the demise of the Great Central Railway as well, because really the Great Central at that time was competing directly with the Midland Main Line, which was operated by the Midland Railway, and then that ran almost parallel to the Great Central up through the centre of the country. And as the Midland region favoured its own route, then the Great Central gradually began to be run down until it was closed in 1966. Fortunately, preservation came along in the early 1970s when the Mainline Steam Trust stepped forward to take over part of the line, and they've obviously, as you might know, they've restored the section between Loughborough and Leicester North, and that's really where we come into the story with this model of the Great Central here. So most of our collection of locomotives is based on that preservation period, which gives a really wide scope of motive power as well. So having gone through all that history of the railway, we'll take a slightly closer look at some of the motive power that's on the layout today. I think one of the important things to note with the preservation period is that literally pretty much any class of loco you can think of that's in preservation has been seen here at one time or another. So whether that be a Western Region locomotive, a Southern Region locomotive, a Midland one or an Eastern one, or in fact the BR Standard as well, they've pretty much all been here at some point. So on the layout today, we'll start at the right at the back here. We've got one of the most famous locomotives, in fact probably the most famous locomotive in the entire world actually, which is Flying Scotsman 60103. Now part of the National Collection, it's been seen at the Great Central Railway on several occasions during its lifetime. In front of that, we've got another very famous locomotive, actually BR's very last in-service steam locomotive, and it's 70013 Oliver Cromwell in BR Green. It's a resident engine at the Great Central Railway. It's part of the National Collection. It's currently being overhauled there for a return to steam soon. In front of the Britannia, we've then got one of the B1460s. Now this one isn't an example of a loco that's actually run on the line in preservation, but it is a representation of that class. So if you're looking for the specific ones that have run in preservation from the B1 class, there's only a choice of two, that's all that are preserved. It's either 61264 or there's 1306 Mayflower as well. I believe both of those have run on the GCR during the preservation era. Taking a look at another 460 and a real stalwart of the Great Central Railway is 6990 Witherslack Hall, which is one of the modified halls. That's from the Western region. Now, interestingly, actually, a couple of these did make it all the way up the Great Central to Leicester and Nottingham in steam days as well. There were quite a few inter-regional workings and also special trains running onto the Great Central in the steam era, and one of these locomotives did make it all the way up the Great Central main line. Moving back to some freight motive power next, and we mentioned the J11 pom-poms earlier on. We've got an example of one of those here on the layout today, which is 64325. These were a classic Robinson design from the Great Central Railway period. Sadly, none of those have been preserved, but nevertheless, Great Central based locomotive, it'd be rude not to have one on the layout today. In front of that, we've got a pair of the Robinson 04280s, another classic Great Central Railway locomotive. As mentioned, 63601, the National Collection locomotive of the 04 class, is based at the Great Central Railway today still, and that's currently being overhauled at the railway. And I've got a model of that here on the layout as well, which is in a much more weathered state than the preserved example has been, so it's looked a little bit different here today. Next up on the layout, we've got an example of the BR9F210, another class which has been quite well known as being part of the Great Central fleet during the steam era and also during preservation as well. Now, as far as I'm aware, the actual real 9220 Evening Star hasn't run on the Great Central in preservation, but again, one of those little details I stand to be corrected on. However, I do know that their resident BR Lime Green 9F 92214 did carry Evening Star nameplates and number for an event a couple of years ago as well. So there is a legitimate reason to have Evening Star here on the layout today as part of the preservation story. Moving forward to another nice big green locomotive, we've got an example of the Bullied Air Smooth Pacific on the layout here. Now actually during preservation, the Great Central has seen examples of the Air Smooth Light Pacific as well as the rebuilt versions as well. Plus they've also had examples of the rebuilt Merchant Navy running on the line as well. This one is 34067 Tangmere, which as far as I'm aware hasn't run on the GCR during preservation, but if you were at the recent Winter Gala in January 2022, you might have seen 257 Squadron, that's 34072 running on the line, which was a great reason for me to go out to that event. In front of the Bullied Pacific, we've got an example of the Fowler Ginty 060 tank, of which there is a resident loco at the GCR. And then in front of that, we've got an example of the Hunslet Austerity in its J94 form as a LNER, well, ex-LNER numbered locomotive, a 68043. Both the Ginty and the J94 are representations of the classes rather than exact locomotives that run on the GCR in preservation, but they're nonetheless to tell the story. Moving a little further afield from my field division, we've also got a few other locos on the layout as well, and one of those is the Stanier 8F280, of which another locomotive class that's been synonymous with the Great Central Railway in preservation. The example we've got on the layout isn't one of the preserved ones, but it is an example of the class nonetheless, and it's got a brilliant sound file as well. Great fun to drive that one. And also, topping off that list of preserved locomotives, we've got 71,000 Duke of Gloucester as well, which is the unique BR8P462, and that's another sound-fitted locomotive, which adds a little bit more class to the scene as well. And a final locomotive to mention as well, we've actually got a representation of one of the Great Central Railway D11 440s. Now, there's only one of these left in preservation, which is 506 Butler Henderson, which is one of the ex-Great Central Railway locomotives. The example I've got on the layout today actually is one of the Scottish directors rather than a Great Central director, but nonetheless, it's a fairly close match for what we're looking at today. Right, that's a quick rundown over the steam motive power. I think we should have a look at some diesels as well. Moving on to the diesel collection, well, you might notice it's slightly thinner than what we've seen before in terms of the steam motive power. And one of the reasons for that actually is that the Great Central in BR days wasn't really served by diesel traction. There were some DMUs and a few Class 25s in terms of the track removal trains at the very end of its career, but actually really it was a steam-worked line from beginning to end was the Great Central Railway. So the selection locos I've got here are more relevant to the preservation era, and you might recognise a couple in terms of their colour schemes, particularly the Gold Mocha Class 31 in the foreground here. This is actually a model of the locomotive that was done in the 1960s in this golden ochre colour scheme, rather than the actual preserved example that's on the Great Central Railway. But well, I think it looks great. It's one of those liveries I've always thought is very eye-catching. It's one of the Hornby Class 31s, is that. Moving on behind that, we've got a smaller collection of locomotives as well. We've got an example of the Class 20, which is one of the new Bachmann models. And the Class 20, well, I think it's D8098 has been based at the Great Central Railways for as long as I can remember, to be quite honest. So it is another long-lived class on the Great Central Railway in preservation there. Another well-recognised class on the railway in preservation will be the Class 46 as well. We've got an example of that set on the layout here behind the Class 20. And that's joined as well by one of the sealed beam Class 45, which has been, I think it was one of the visiting locos to the railway. The Brush Type 4 as well, another very well-known locomotive on the Great Central Railway in preservation. The example there being D1705 Sparrowhawk, which used to be in BR two-tone green like this, but has more recently been painted in BR blue. Moving on to something very recognisable again for people, actually the Metro Camel Class 101 DMU. And many people have seen this both at steam events and diesel events, where it tends to run a shuttle service between Loughborough and Quorn and Roadley. And it's a great way to see the Great Central Railway as well, through the windows behind the driver, looking down the line as you approach on that double track main line. Behind that, we've got an example of, actually it's a Class 24 one, but actually in terms of what we're doing today, it's here to represent the Class 25 instead, as there's one of those based at the railway. Now, there are plenty of other diesels you could look at as well to run on the Great Central Railway if you're building in preservation. For starters, it had examples of the Class 42 Warship. There have also been examples of the Class 55 Deltic, and many will recognise the Network South East liveried Class 50 that's been a regular on the line as well. There have also been examples of the Class 37 running on the line, with probably one of the most distinctive being 37714, which is the only heavyweight Class 37 in preservation. That's soon to be joined by D6700, the first of the split head code Class 37s, which is just joining the Great Central Railway from the National Collection as well.
Right, well, I think that's enough talking from us for this. I think it's time we had a decent running session now, because they've put up with 4 hours, as good as 4 hours of us building this layout. It's finally time to have a play.
To see it working.
Well, I think the layout runs rather well.
So it seems to. I'm pleased with it now. That's a few adjustments along the way.
And of course, if you enjoyed this build series, don't forget you can read all the related articles around the Great Central and the Great Central build here on Key Model World. So make sure you go and check out the landing page And of course, the link to that will be in the description under this video.
That's right, and also if you prefer, you can also read the features in paper form in our yearbooks as well. So you've got your choice there. If you're one of our Key Model World subscribers, you might like to take in some of that in our digital media, but you've also got the choice to take it in paper form as well. So the Great Central Build was done across our 2021 and 2022 Hornby Magazine yearbooks, issues number 13 and 14. And well, we enjoy putting them together, and you hope you enjoy them whether you take them in digitally or in print as well.
I particularly like the train formations in there as well, because that's very handy.
Yeah, and there are other things actually we should say in that yearbook which aren't in the Key Model World website as well. So you do get some exclusive bits in both places. So there's things you see on the website you'll never see in print, there's things you'll see in print which you'll never see on the website as well.
Yeah. So that brings us to the end, for now, of another build series. So thank you very much for watching, and for watching the previous 3 episodes. Do pay attention, because there will be a 5th, we've heard it here first, episode coming, which will probably be closer to the November mark, maybe just afterwards. But as ever, thank you very much for watching.
Yeah, and remember, thank you for watching up to the end of the series, but there is still more of the series to come.
Yes. So take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.